Media literacy is extremely important, and not just media literacy in the way that, institutions that are government sponsored or NGOs that are co-opted express, because that is usually goes along with, you know, fact-checking institutions or organizations that are administered by think tanks like the Atlantic Council telling us what is and what is not a Russian bot or disinformation. No, I'm talking about critical media literacy. This is media literacy that should be widespread and across all of our education. Because what it means is that you, as a media consumer, are understanding where this information is being filtered from and through, and who is administering it, and what their biases and invested interests are. And that's what's so crucial and I think missing from a lot of the dialogue about media literacy today is that critical lens that we need. Where is this information coming from? And who's telling it? And why are they telling it? So today we're seeing a big struggle with critical media literacy education and also avenues of independent media's survivability under global capitalism. Over the last couple decades, we've seen corporate media consolidate their messaging and filter down a lot of things that used to be avenues for independent journalism to thrive and survive and to sustain itself. But I think corporate media systematically it fails as an institution under capitalism because it exists to prop up the narratives that mythologize capitalism and which accompanies U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism, and propping up the same institution that essentially acts to dictate to us what the truth and reality is. And unfortunately, when that's coming from the top down, under a media system that's subsidized by the very corporate entities that journalism should be exposing, which is, the defense industry, banking, oil, food. I mean, all of these things that are essential components of our lives to understand how they all intertwine with the system that we live in. They are all subsidized by the very agency that should be investigating them. So investigative journalism is essentially non-existent. It's very hard to get the funding for alternative journalism to investigate corruption within political systems, to critique capitalism. And so, unfortunately, it exists the way it is today, where a lot of journalism students kind of are berated with the notion of neutrality. And for me, I'm an advocacy journalist. And so the concept of neutrality for me is really non-existent, and it's kind of cartoonish when you're looking at the way that corporate media operates, six corporations dictating everything that we see, hear, and read, 90% of everything that we see, hear, and read. And I wear my advocacy and my bias on my sleeve. And so take me as I come. And I can circumvent the biases that I'm working with, whether it be Russia Today or Telesur in the past, where I went to those networks to tell the truth about my country, because corporate media doesn't give you the avenues to do so. And so not only are journalism students getting into, avenues of professional journalism kind of consumed with that idea of neutrality when it really isn't existent, especially when you're working in institutions like the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these other Beltway publications that essentially couch the opinions of corporate media journalists into appeal to authority. Think tanks that essentially are subsidized by the very entities that we're trying to critique as well. So everyone has an opinion. It's just a matter of how are you going to express those opinions under the authority of someone else and using those as references and sources. That is why a free press is so essential and so difficult in this system. We live in a country that lauds the First Amendment. We have so many movies and, cultural like reverence for this institution of a free press. It's the founding principle of our so-called beloved democracy. But unfortunately, there's no real free press today. It's a veneer, and I think that that's the problem is when you think of an idea like censorship, you typically look at countries like China or Russia. That's what we're told, right? But really, our free press is diminishing more and more, whether it's a journalist like Julian Assange being charged with treason and espionage for simply publishing leaks, which is the founding principle of what every publication should do, exposing war crimes, or whether it's something like the shrinking avenues of funding for alternative media to survive and to report on real issues and to expose the powers that be and to also uplift grassroots voices. As an independent journalist, as someone who's paved my own way outside of the system and charted kind of another territory that a lot of other independent journalists have done that are focusing on issues of US foreign policy and, uplifting activist voices, I think that's what instructs me the most is going to uh, these fights and struggles, the front lines of people who are putting their bodies on the lines, people who are really dedicating themselves to the cause of change, and linking these struggles together, understanding that we have a common enemy and it all connects. And that's why I feel like really going to the source, the grassroots, the people who are on the ground doing that work and putting their voices front and center instead of, wondering what is the establishment saying to degrade and diminish the voices of those people that we really need to be hearing from. And so I think that there's so many things that differentiate independent journalism to corporate journalism. Another thing is, corporate news journalists kind of have to be true believers in the system. They have to believe in the orthodoxy of capitalism and US imperialism in order to do these jobs. Because, look, you're not going to sustain your career if you want to critique the US empire or US foreign policy. It's just not the way things work. And so you're going to have a really hard time navigating that field. And that's just the way it's designed. So again, there's a tremendous roadblocks for independent journalists and advocacy journalists like myself, but we have to keep fighting and we have to keep struggling because this is the most important thing. True independent grassroots media and linking and uplifting each other's voices is the most crucial thing that we can do for change because without an avenue to tell these stories, no one's going to hear them. And we have to reveal that, right? We have to reveal that and we have to keep showing the truth on the ground and the reality on the ground if we want to sustain change and provide a viable future. The Palestine-Israel conflict, quote unquote, I love that they call it a war because it's just the opposite of that. I mean, how could you call a territory that's being just bombarded with high technology and the people that you're bombarding have no standing army or means to really defend themselves. But yeah, I think that this is a really stark example and probably the most incredible example and lucid example of how the media works to paint one side with a broad brush and the other side as, the defenders of democracy. So just like every US ally and adversary, you're going to see its appendage, which is the corporate media, provide those narratives to uphold the US State Department and the goals of US foreign policy. So that's demonizing Palestinians and painting Israelis and the Israeli government as heroes, essentially, defenders of terrorism. And that's what this is really about. And you see the same thing whether you're looking at Cuba or Venezuela or China or Russia. It's really kind of cartoonishly depicted in a black and white fashion with no nuance whatsoever. The media has failed abysmally when it comes to the Palestine-Israel issue, and that's why public opinion here in America is actually the last to shift around the world. I would say that Americans are among the most propagandized, even though we believe that we're the most free and that we have the freest media. That's part of the propaganda specifically so. There's several layers to especially the Palestine propaganda that I think are the most egregious and insidious examples of how this all operates. The first one being the passive voice. In an insidious fashion, you're always hearing that Palestinians die as if they just mysteriously drop dead instead of being murdered, killed, or massacred in the ways that the corporate media describes Israelis. It also just kind of absolves Israel from the war crimes that it commits. For example, the Ali Arab hospital that was bombed by Israel, the media just took Israeli narratives at face value, whether it was the Ali Arab hospital being bombed or the 40 beheaded babies or the mass rape. These stories that are used to paint Palestinians as terrorists, to demonize and dehumanize them at large. And really, when the truth comes out, days or weeks or months later, these corrections are never administered. The same weight is not given to the corrections, and those lies are cemented as truth. You will never hear corporate media pick up what Hamas officials say and run it as a press release. But whether it be CNN or MSNBC or the New York Times or all these papers of record, they will just reprint IDF press releases as if they are real news. And I'm talking about Reuters and AP too. I mean, a lot of people think Reuters and AP are like these neutral delivery sources. No, they are heavily biased at pro-Israel narratives that are put out there. And it all comes from the same source, right? So it's the State Department or its appendage, which is Israel, the Israeli press, and they will reprint them unquestioningly so. And if you look at the big scandal that just erupted with the New York Times, I mean, this is a perfect example of how this bias operates within this institution, where you had an award-winning journalist, Jasmine Hughes, resign at the beginning of the genocidal onslaught because she merely signed a letter that said Israel was committing genocide. This is something that the highest court in the land agrees with, the ICJ, right? That there's a plausible case for this. But she was forced to resign at her post. And then you see this big, giant story that adjudicates the atrocities on October 7th. Screams Without Words, released by the New York Times, which asserted that there was widespread systematic rape done by Hamas militants on October 7th. Not only did the family of one of the alleged victims come out and say that it was falsified, that this was not true, but then later what came out is that the author of the story, the co-author of the story, Anat Schwartz, had liked multiple tweets, basically supporting genocide against Palestinians and dehumanizing them. It's absolutely incredible. One of the statements that she liked on Twitter as a post was actually used by the International Court of Justice as incitement to genocide from one of these Israeli officials. You have a Washington I'm sorry, you have a Wall Street Journal story called Intelligence Reveals Details of U.S. Agencies Staff's Links to October 7th Attack. A co-author of that story, Carrie Keller Lynn, served in the Israeli military. And we know weeks later there was no evidence that UNRWA was tied to Hamas. This was the result of torture. Torture. And what sane world is torture used as evidence to cut off funding for this humanitarian organization that was providing life-saving aid in the Gaza Strip? So for me, I mean, as someone who was radicalized by the Iraq War and saw how these institutions played a direct role in propagandizing and conditioning the American public for the post 9/11 war frenzy, I feel like these same institutions are doing the same thing today. That's what they exist to do. It's not like they haven't learned their lessons. This is why they exist, to serve empire and to condition the American public, to manufacture that consent. And so when I say, yeah, bring Biden to The Hague next to Netanyahu, I mean, I feel like the editorial line being run by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and all these other papers of record that are running cover for Israel's crimes, these people also need to be held accountable because they are also accomplices to genocide. And again, I mean, the layers are just so, so deep when it comes to the Palestine propaganda. It's insulting to our intelligence, but I think that the more and more that Palestinians are able to dictate their own reality and show the world what they're experiencing, more people are waking up. And that's why you see generationally this huge rejection of corporate media. It's really just the younger that you are, the more that you're seeking truth elsewhere. Because I think people are tired of the powers that be and these corporate media institutions telling them this is what reality is, denying Palestinians of their agency and lying to us and telling us, don't believe your lying eyes, right? When we see the truth for ourselves. So it's a beautiful thing that's happening. And with the advent of social media, with people being able to see just on their devices, live streamed, the truth live streamed, as dark and dystopian as it may be, in a way, it's very empowering to have those tools in our hands and to be able to see with free minds and moral clarity what's really going on. Media literacy should be integrated with internationalism, solidarity with global activism. I mean, for me as an advocacy journalist and as an activist at heart who uses media as a tool for social change, all of these things are interconnected and should be integrated with each other. So for me, I mean, I go to the source. I try to cover these social movements and figure out a way how we can link our struggles together and uplift each other's voices. And so it's empowering, it's beautiful, the collective consciousness that's exploding around the world, the social movements that are exploding around the world. I'm here for it. I want to cover it. I want to be the media voice for it. And I think that people who are earnest, who want to be involved, who also are passionate about media literacy, critical media literacy, can do that, can go and be the voice for their community, can pick up the tools right in their hand and go teach themselves how to edit, how to film. I mean, you have the device right here. Go be that person, go be that citizen journalist and cover those struggles in your community. And I think it'll all fall into place if people really go out there and be active voices and active participants in that. Because we all have the tools, we all have the capacity, and we need it. We need you to do that. And, as stifling as an environment as it is, I think that this is something that's really beautiful and we can embrace it and we can use it to empower ourselves and empower our communities.